Hey, I'm Geeky Pastimes, and this is the start of a new series where I'm going to be talking you through the lore of the Halo series. And the idea is that it's going to build up all the way from the very beginning of the Halo story, all the way up ready for Halo Infinite. So hopefully people who are maybe new to the Halo series, people who have maybe been curious about it and like played similar games but never really paid attention to what's really going on, will all be kind of ready for Halo Infinite to make the most of it. Now, loads of what I'm going to talk about comes from this amazing book, which I really like. This is the Halo Mythos, a guide to the story of Halo. This is a book that 343 worked on. It's really, really cool, got loads of really cool artwork in there, loads of really cool details, and lots of stuff about the Halo story that I didn't really know in the first place. Like, I really like this. So if you want to hear more about the sort of stuff that I'm talking about, go buy that book, The Halo Mythos. Absolutely awesome. Now, the sort of lore behind Halo doesn't just come from the video games. There's obviously the main series of games, you know, Halo 1 all the way through to Halo 5. But then there's also been the 2 Halo Wars games. There's also been a series of novels. There's been some graphic novels. There's been some sort of made-for-the-internet sort of movie shorts and things like that. There's been a lot of different stuff that kind of feeds into the Halo story, so it's completely understandable to even people who have played all the Halo games might not know where a lot of things come from, might not know the reasons behind things, stuff like that. Now, these videos aren't going to be terribly long. I'm going to try and keep them short and keep them to one kind of topic each. They're also not going to be terribly in depth. Like, I get, you know, if you're into Destiny lore, you might have seen Bife's videos. Like, he does these incredible ones of loads and loads of dates, loads of names, loads of like really incredible research and stuff like that. I'm sort of less interested in all stuff like that. Like, the dates and things like that matter less to me. This is going to be a kind of surface level overview of everything that happened to help you understand it and all of the things that I think are kind of the major events, the things that are important in the world of Halo. So you'll kind of understand when you see like certain characters show up, you'll know who they are. When you see certain races do things, or when you see certain sort of buildings or ships or things like that, you might have a better understanding of where they come from and what that's all about. So this first episode that I'm going to be talking to you about today is all about the Forerunners. So the Forerunners are probably a race that you've heard of. It's probably something that, like, I think is the deepest level that most people's Halo knowledge will go to, is the idea that the Forerunners exist. And the last couple of games have dealt with them a lot more than the first few games did. The Forerunners are the ones who built pretty much everything in Halo, including the Halos. So whenever you've seen buildings and, you know, anything unusual, anything ominous in Halo, if it's purple, it's probably the Covenant. And if it looks kind of like a gun or a tank, it's probably human. If it's spiky, it's probably built by the Brutes. But if it's kind of grey and has blue light coming out of it, it's probably the Forerunners. Loads of the buildings that you see in Halo, like going right back to Halo 1, when you crash onto the Halo and you go to that first structure where the Marines are fighting, that's built by the Forerunners. All of those mysterious tunnels, all of the, I mean, everything literally on the Halos, because they built the Halos, all of the things like the Ark and stuff like that that comes into later games, it's all made by the Forerunners. And the Forerunners for the first few games weren't really a kind of tangible presence. They were sort of seen as this race that were lost to history. They're like very, very mysterious. No one seemed to know much about them. The humans didn't seem to know much about them. And different like species within the Covenant had different ideas about what they were and what they meant and what their intentions were. They also tried to kill everything at one point, so they're sort of like their morality is definitely questionable, but I'll try and explain where they were coming from and why they were the way they were. So the Forerunners, first of all, weren't the first sentient life in the galaxy, in the Halo universe. That goes to the Precursors. So the Precursors are an even more mysterious and ancient race that existed a long time before the Forerunners and kind of created all of the major races in the galaxy. We don't really know like how they did that or why they did that, but it seems like they were responsible for the creation of all of the other races. And then they just left. Now this has happened something like 10 million years ago. So obviously, if you look back, you know, charts of history on Earth and stuff like that, it seems like obviously we had life on Earth 10 million years ago, you know, dinosaurs and stuff like that are way older than that. But the Precursors seemingly seeded kind of what was going to become sentient life. So things like humanity and the race that become the Prophets and the Forerunners. So they were all created by these Precursors, but then they all left the galaxy for some reason, or moved to a very sort of part a long way out of it, somewhere out on the very edge of the Milky Way. Now, long after that happened, so long after the Precursors left, the Forerunners rose to prominence and started developing technology incredibly quickly. One of their big things that they invented was slip space, or they managed to find a way to access slip space. And slip space is a kind of extra dimension that by going into it, the sort of same rules of physics don't apply. You can actually travel through it and then travel faster than light. So this enabled the Forerunners to be able to start exploring the galaxy incredibly quickly, started being able to move between planets. They actually started being able to create their own planets. They created Dyson spheres, so they created sort of these huge structures around a sun, which could then be powered by that sun. So they were really, really good at building stuff. They absolutely loved building stuff. They also developed a philosophy that became really important to them that was called the Mantle of Responsibility. And this sounded like a really nice idea. It was just the idea that whichever race was the most advanced in the galaxy, whichever race was kind of the dominant race in the galaxy, technology-wise and thought-wise, should be protecting all other life in the galaxy. So should have a responsibility to protect everything else. And they obviously immediately just placed themselves in that position. They saw themselves as the most important race in the galaxy. And so they decided that they were taking on the mantles of responsibility and that they were going to be kind of the guardians of the rest of the galaxy. Now, this all got sort of thrown into disarray when, while they were exploring the galaxy, they actually just by chance happened to run into the Precursors. So the Precursors, who had created all life and then left, or sentient life rather, and then left, they actually ran into them somewhere right on the edge of the galaxy. And when they did that, they were able to speak to the Precursors, and they found out that the Precursors didn't like them. And the Precursors didn't think they deserved the Mantle of Responsibility, that they wanted to strip it from them and give it to another race. The Precursors thought that the Forerunners were too arrogant. Now, the Forerunners who'd been involved in this were horrified at this. You know, they had thought that they were the most important ones. They couldn't get used to the idea that they might get replaced by a different race. And so they launched the largest military campaign that had ever been seen against the Precursors. They decided to try and destroy the Precursors so there wouldn't be anyone left to challenge them. And they won. Like, it was a horrendous battle. Most of the Forerunner warriors were killed in it, but they did end up destroying the Precursors, or nearly all of the Precursors. The Precursors had actually created something called the Primordial, which was one of their own. It was one of the Precursors, but it had been sort of genetically modified to be able to last for millennia, to be able to last for absolute aeons and get more and more powerful as a way of getting vengeance on the Forerunners one day. So the Primordial had been hidden somewhere and the Forerunners didn't know about it. But that was like the Precursors' last kind of chance to get their own back on the Forerunners. But the Forerunners killed the Precursors anyway, pretty much. And they weirdly didn't tell the rest of the Forerunners about it. These Forerunners who'd been on the expedition had gone through this incredible war, and for some reason they felt that they shouldn't tell the other Forerunners about the idea that actually they had found their creators and murdered them. So they kind of kept that to themselves a little bit. Now, after all of this had happened, the Forerunners ended up just running the galaxy for millions of years. Like, they were so much more powerful than anyone else. They were building things absolutely everywhere. They had complete dominance of the galaxy. And that meant we can now sort of find their structures all over the place. Like, there's so many different things hidden around because the Forerunner civilization lasted for a huge amount of time. They had a really, really strict caste system that, because they'd evolved as this sort of singular society for so long, some of the parts of their species had evolved to do certain jobs. And this meant the Forerunners didn't really have a lot of freedom, and this ends up becoming important quite a bit later on, that the Forerunners were born into a certain job and they just did that till they died. There was a potential for promotion, but if you got promoted, you actually had to go through a kind of genetic altering, you had to go through mutations in order to turn into the other caste to be able to do a different job, so it was something that rarely happened. Now, the Forerunner Empire was known as the Ecumene, and I think, you know, there's a lot of language within the Halo lore that's kind of linked to, like, you know, churches and things like that. And I don't think that's by mistake. So it was known as the Ecumene, and it consisted of about 3 million separate worlds. So that sort of gives you an idea of the scale of their civilization. The capital planet was known as Mephrilium. And this was a planet that they'd built. This was an artificial planet that they'd created. They also had something called the domain. Now, the domain is like a huge database, and it was a database that kind of broke the laws of physics because it didn't have a restriction on the amount of space in it, on the amount of information it could store. Instead, it had all of the knowledge of the entire Forerunner civilization and all of the knowledge that they could find from any other civilizations. And it could even contain things like memories and personal experiences. Like, the Forerunners experimented with the idea of being able to kind of upload their consciousness. And again, we'll come to talk a bit more about that later. Now, they didn't create the domain. The domain was something that they found, and they thought that it was probably created by the Precursors at some point, and it was something left over from that civilization. So they didn't fully understand the domain, but they knew that they could use it to store information and to store knowledge and things like that. The rule of the Forerunners was enforced very, very strictly by a military, and the military was led by the Didact. Now, the Didact is one of the few Forerunners that ends up being really important to the Halo story. There was the Didact, and there was his wife called the Librarian. Yes, the Librarian responsible for the library, that horrible level in Halo. Those two Forerunners, the Didact and Librarian, end up being really the only two that matter at all. So those are the two names that you kind of need to remember. Didact was the military leader, Librarian was his wife, and obviously, as the name suggests, more interested in things like knowledge and the domain. Now, while the Forerunners were the dominant race in the galaxy, they weren't alone at all. There were two other fairly important races, and one of them was humanity. Bear in mind, we're talking, millions of years ago. This is the same humans as what we are, but a long, long time ago, using technology that we've lost. Humans had spread from Earth to other planets and started exploring, and they'd come across another race called the Sanshum, who were kind of what in the games you end up seeing the prophets. The prophets were part of that race. So the humans came across them and formed an alliance with them as kind of the two second most powerful races in the galaxy. They formed an alliance and they actually settled a planet together, and that was called Sharam Hakor. And that was this really prosperous planet because they worked together so well. It ended up developing really quickly. Technology was developing really quickly, and obviously it's something that the Forerunners needed to keep an eye on. Now, that's the end of the first video. That's kind of your introduction to the Forerunners. The next video is going to deal with how the humans messed everything up and got everyone killed, essentially. If you like this video, because it's a bit of an experiment, please don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have questions about any of this lore, please leave it in the comments below. I'd really, really like to hear what you have to say, and I'll answer the ones that I can, and I'll try and find answers to the ones that I can't. Maybe someone else will be able to answer. If you've got suggestions for how you'd like this format to change, let me know. I'm kind of keen on keeping it this kind of chatty, conversational type thing, rather than doing something, really, really, really complex and huge and a massive undertaking. I'd rather it to be this kind of casual thing. So, thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.